Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Welcome to In the Word. We're glad you could join us today. We're in the book of Habakkuk again, and there's more to talk about as we talk about justice in the prophets of the Old Testament. Dr. Blackburn is here again, and we're looking at this passage, the chapter 2 of Habakkuk today. And there's another side of what we looked at last week.
Yeah, finally some resolution.
Right. It's not all happiness and good news, but it is justice.
Right. Yes.
So the title of it is Consequences for Injustice. And as we talked last week, the answer that God gave to Habakkuk about how bad Judah was at the end of the 7th century, early 6th century, was that God was going to use Babylon to correct them. And Habakkuk was shocked and said, how can that be? Babylon's worse than we are. That doesn't really answer the question at all, but that's the way it was left.
Yes.
He didn't have the answer. Well, today, we're going to deal with Babylon.
Yes, right.
Well, we're looking at chapter 2 of Habakkuk, and as we said last week, the little book of Habakkuk has just 3 chapters. The first chapter are these questions that are raised. How can you tolerate the evil that's going on in our country? And Habakkuk is lamenting that. And then the verses that we didn't have in our text last week, God says, I'll take care of that. I'm going to use Babylon. And then describes how brutal Babylon is. And Habakkuk comes back and says, how can that be the answer? And that was the end of chapter 1.
Right.
But as we moved into chapter 2, the first part of chapter 2, essentially God says to Habakkuk, just wait.
Right.
It's not all over yet. But then we're going to look at the text today as a passage that follows that, and God's going to deal with Babylon. But there's a verse at the beginning of chapter 2 that we just can't ignore, even though it's not in our text. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, where the phrase is there, the just shall live by faith.
Yes.
Where do we hear that again?
I believe we hear that in the New Testament, specifically,
over and over.
Specifically Paul. Mm-hmm. He loved that passage.
And Hebrews, it's in Hebrews too.
Hebrews, yes, it is.
Yeah. So, but it's the recognition that Christians have got to look back that even though things may look terrible, the just will live by faith, and faith means you're trusting God to work it out in His good time.
Yes.
But meanwhile, here's Babylon. So we've got to deal with that. Well, let's go ahead and read the text. So if you would read for us today.
I'll be happy to. Will not all of them taunt him, that is Babylon, with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey, because you have plundered many nations. The people who have left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
Okay, thank you. Well, Babylon has conquered the world, or at least that's
Yes.
what was about to happen as Habakkuk looked at it. And their method of operation was come in with a big stick and knock everybody down,
Right.
which they did. They just swept over. They knocked out Assyria. They swept across the Middle East, and everybody fell to them, even all the way down to Egypt.
Yes.
So it looked like Habakkuk is anticipating what's going to be going on during this time, or maybe seeing some of it actually transpire.
Right.
And Babylon is just top of the world.
Right. Unstoppable.
Yeah, they conquer everybody. They're in control of everything. But there's another side to this.
Yes. Yes,
and
there
God
is.
says injustice is going to have to be righted.
And you know, at the time, it's important to remember at the time that this prophecy is given, there's no indication of the fall of Babylon.
No.
So this message here has to be accepted only in faith. You can't see Babylon. You can't see the future of Babylon. So that's an important thing to remember, I think, at this point, that you know, when the Lord says these things, you could only trust that what the Lord is saying is true. You couldn't actually see it at this point.
Yeah. And the reality is, you know, as you look back through history, the kingdoms rise and fall.
Yes.
And each one has to bear the consequences of what they've caused. And that was the case with Babylon. But during this time, people couldn't see that righting of the balance.
Right. They looked invincible.
Yeah. Well, let's look at the specifics here. In chapter 2, verse 6, will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn? Who's the them and who's the him?
Well, it looks like the them are the other nations that have been the objects of
world.
Babylon's predation, and the him, then the Babylonian Empire personified as a man.
Yeah, we'll see as we look through the text where it talks about singular pronouns, him. It's really talking about the nation, and sometimes
Right.
it talks about building sounds like a house. It's probably
Right.
the empire.
Right, exactly.
So he's speaking of the nation of Babylon and what they've done. But the woe that comes in verse 6 is the first of several woes. You've got 5 different woes in chapter 2 here. So what Habakkuk is seeing is, you may look big now, but there's going to be a comeuppance. There's going to be a righting of the balance.
Absolutely. You know, the way empires work and the way they operate is they move into different new territories and they steal what belongs to other people. That's just, they can call it whatever they want to. They usually don't call it stealing.
No.
But I couldn't help but, you know, as we think about this passage, think about what happened during the colonial period of the 18th and 19th century and how many European countries entered into third world countries and essentially stole their national resources.
Yeah.
And that's the reason they went there. And that's, you know, there's a lot of an analogy between that and what Babylon did.
People are looking in this century at what was done the last 2 or 3
Right.
as some of the museums of the world that are so famous are filled with things from those other countries, and some of those are being returned.
Yes.
Recognizing it's part of their heritage, not ours.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I was in the museum, the National Egyptian Museum, and the people there are looking forward to getting some of the things back from the British Museum.
Yeah. It's a major movement now to correct some of the excesses. But Babylon had lived that way, and Habakkuk saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. So you've used and abused these other people, these other nations, and now they're going to pay a price for that.
Yes. And there is another way of reading the second part of verse 6 in the NIV, where it says that Babylon makes himself wealthy by extortion. It's also possible to understand that as Babylon loads himself with goods taken in pledge. That is to say, he's gone into all these other countries and he's taken what is not his, and so really he's become a debtor. That's not the way Babylon saw it, of course, but now they owe all this stuff to the other nations. And the next verse indicates that the time is coming when the creditors, the other nations, are going to call in their loans.
Suddenly arise, and it's interesting that one expression of that, they will rise up with suddenness and bite. So yes. They're going to come back and not biting the hand that feeds you, but the hand that stole from you.
That's right.
And they'll wake up and make you tremble. It's like a strong wind shaking a tree.
Yeah.
They're going to get their time, and yours is coming. You're on top now, but you may be the bottom.
I couldn't help but think as reading this that, Babylon had taught the other nations how to do this. They had taught the other nations how to go in and pillage and rape and steal, and now the other nations, having learned that, are going to come do it to Babylon.
Yeah. And when Persia conquered Babylon, it was like a house of cards. It fell very quickly. I mean, Babylon just seemed invincible, and after Assyria had been so dominant for so many centuries, it looked like Babylon was going to be that way for a long time. It was a short time, really.
Very short time, less than a century.
Yeah. And that at that time, people couldn't envision that was going to be the case.
Exactly.
But Habakkuk seeing it. In verse 8 then, because you've plundered many nations, the peoples who are left will plunder you. You took what you wanted, and now they're going to take what they want. For you've shed human blood, you've destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Sounds almost like an ecological destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting to think, especially the verse that talks about destroying lands and cities and everyone in them, to realize that this is what Babylon is going to do to Judah in the impending invasion of Judah. They're going to come in, they're going to destroy Judah's defensive cities. They're going to come to Jerusalem. They're going to raise the temple. They're going to pull down the walls. And this is how Babylonian has operated. This is their MO.
Yeah.
And it's the boomerang effect. What they have done is now going to be done to them.
What goes around comes around.
Yeah.
And woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain. He's not talking about just a house.
Right.
He's talking more about the empire.
Yes.
He built the empire by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. Sounds like eagles.
Yes, it does. It's interesting that in the little book of Obadiah, in verse 3, there's only one chapter of that book, there is a statement about Edom, which was a traditional enemy of Judah, south of Judah. And the statement is made that Edom has made their dwellings in the clefts of the rock, but God says, though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down. So it sounds very similar to the judgment pronounced on Babylon here.
Very similar. The idea that an eagle's nest is out of reach of predators, not out of reach of God.
One of the things Nebuchadnezzar was known for was his great building projects. And he did do incredible things for the city of Babylon. It became a showplace for the world because of that. And I can't help but think that in verse 9 there's a kind of an allusion there to Nebuchadnezzar, the great builder, who builds his great city and tries to fortify it in such a way that it will, that it will be established forever. But he can't. He can't. No one can.
Yeah, and he built it on the backs of the slave labor he used.
Exactly.
And those people have not been forgotten by God.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you've plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. Shame and honor is a standard of value to many peoples of the East. And that term here is, again, part of this recompense. You've looked big, you looked great, you looked powerful, but there's a shame involved in it.
Yeah. What Nebuchadnezzar and what the Babylonians considered to be their glory was in fact not, but rather their shame, because of the cost to lives and people and nations to build it.
Yeah. And, thinking about our current situation today, to much of the world, America is what it is because of the view they have from Hollywood.
Yeah.
And to a lot of peoples of the world, that's really an example of decadence.
Yeah.
And where we think of it as glory and greater than all the nations, some people look at it as shame.
Right.
And not glory.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's kind of what Babylon was being accused of here by Habakkuk. Well, the stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. If these walls could talk, and they will, Habakkuk says.
This probably should be connected closely to the word house in the previous verse. You've shamed your own house, that is, your own empire, your own government. And the empire was actually built on the backs of, people who were killed and people who were impressed into slavery to do work on the city of Babylon. And there's an interesting this idea that sort of inanimate objects can cry out to God is not completely new in the Bible. In Genesis, God approaches Cain, who's killed his brother Abel, and Abel can no longer cry out. He can no longer object because he's been killed. But God says, his blood from the ground cries out to me. And so in a similar way, I think that the very buildings of Babylon cry out over the injustice of how they've come to be and how they've come to be built.
Yeah.
And we're not immune to this ourselves. I mean, you think about a number of American landmarks were built at least partially by slave labor. And this is true not only of the White House, but also of our Capitol building. So this is not just it's not a theoretical idea, it's not something that just applies to ancient history.
And some of what was done by our ancestors in previous generations or even centuries, we can say, well, that was then and this is now, and we have nothing to do with that.
Right.
But our walls cry out sometimes too.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. Well, the woe is repeated in verse 12. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. And that's really what Habakkuk's saying Babylon's reputation is, that they've built their power and their grandeur on bloodshed and injustice, and God has not ignored that.
Yes. It's the total opposite contrast from what is said in Psalm 127:2. where the statement is made, if the Lord and his righteousness are not the builder of the house, then those who work on it are going to labor in vain.
Yeah.
And this is a house, Babylon is a house that is built not by the Lord, but through bloodshed, injustice, and the cruelty of war.
And the whole passage here in chapter 2 of Habakkuk is that God has not ignored this. And the time is coming when there will be a price to be paid. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? It's been reduced to ashes. All of this that was so grand and so great. Have you been to the city of Babylon in Iraq?
I have not.
There's no real city to go to anymore. We can find some ruins, we can find some artifacts, archaeological evidence, but the city is gone.
It's no longer there.
It was the capital of the world at this time, but it's not now.
Yeah, it almost seems like verse 13 might be a possible reference to Babylon's use of enforced labor to build its capital and to build other aspects of its empire. And the Lord has determined that all that Babylon accomplished, often through slave labor and through theft, that is all going to come to nothing.
Yeah. Well, verse 14 is a total change.
Yes.
After all this bad news for Babylon, then Habakkuk says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea."
Yeah.
There is going to be a day when God's glory is seen and these injustices are taken care of. It may not be today, it may not be in your lifetime, but it's coming.
And it did come, and as you said earlier, rather quickly. In the even before this century is over, in 539, the Persians take Cyrus and his Persian Empire. Babylon just crumbles and collapses before their power, and they become merely a province of the Persian Empire after that. So a pretty ignominious end to what's going on. And one thing to be remembered here is not only does verse 14 prophesy the destruction of Babylon, but remember what happened when Cyrus took over. One of the first things he did was to allow the Jews to return to Judah.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the destruction of Babylon, it's also about the rescue and vindication of the Jews, that they are now allowed to return. And I suppose one way I read this in one of the commentaries that I thought was quite good. It says, "The Lord's destruction of Babylon will make God's glory transparent to the whole world." Will make people see the glory of the Lord, and not just the destruction, but also the return of His people back to their home.
Well, last week you read from Longfellow's poem, "Heard the Bells on Christmas Day."
Yes.
You didn't read the last verse, but there is a last verse.
There is a last verse, and it kind of fits into this verse that we've just looked at, verse 14, because verse 14 indicates that Babylon's time is up. It's been a long period of injustice, but it's coming to an end. And so last week I read the first three stanzas of "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day," and of course those three stanzas talk about the wonderful words of Christmas: peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in the third stanza, the poet says, yes, but all of that, those words are mocked by the violence, the hatred, the war that is going on. And then in the 4th verse, it reads like this: "Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail. With peace on earth, goodwill to men." And I think that's the answer. As you said earlier, you have to look at the long haul. You have to look at the long picture. And the long picture is that we as Christians, by faith, by trust, believe that all wrongs will be righted, and that all injustice will be exposed for what it is, and that everything will be set right by our God.
And that's where the New Testament brings us the Prince of Peace, who has come to make a difference in all of life. And Philippians chapter 2 is a passage we just have to turn back to at this point, because it talks about he humbled himself and was obedient unto death, even death on a cross, and God has highly exalted him. And then it goes on to say, and every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father.
Yeah.
And that's really what Habakkuk is saying here. Things may look bad at a given time, but God has not ignored it, and the time will come when things will be righted.
We long for resolution. We long for things to be put right. I think, as you and I were talking earlier, I think one of the reasons why we enjoy seeing certain kinds of movies and programs on television is because we can be assured that by the end of the program, justice will prevail. And that's what we so often don't see happening in life. But there's this powerful impulse within us to see everything put right. And, you know, I personally, and I know you feel the same way, but I would have a very hard time living my life if I did not have that conviction.
Right.
If I thought that so many wrongs will never go righted, and that so many people who suffer will never be healed and saved, it'd be very difficult to go through this life.
But God is in control, and that's what the message of the whole Bible is, that things will be right. And in addition to what we find in the text we've got, verse 20 of chapter 2 says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple, that all the earth keeps silence before him."
Yes.
And so Habakkuk comes back to the point of saying God is still in charge.
Yes.
And chapter 3, if you haven't read Habakkuk, you need to read that psalm of chapter 3, which talks about God's faithfulness through history, and comes to the conclusion at the end of the chapter saying, even if everything falls apart, I will trust the Lord, and I know that He's got my best interest in mind.
That's beautiful.
Well, we hope that you'll be back with us next week. We're thankful you've been here today. We hope this has been helpful to you. We look forward to being in the Word with you again. May God bless you.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.